everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, March 26th, 2024. Today we're going to talk about Jacques Derrida's notion of absolute hospitality. And I'm going to give you a couple ideas about why this is a very important resource as we continue to try to navigate our own societal and political and cultural structures where we are. Before we dive in, make sure you hop over to Philosophy in the Wild on Substack. Check out the work I'm doing there. I would love to connect with you. Paid and free subscriptions are available. Make sure also that you remember that the new Audible version of Camping with Kierkegaard is now available. So if you would like to hear me read the book to you, you can make that happen. Finally, all kinds of extra resources available at jaaronsimmons.com. So please don't forget to check those out and hear the new podcasts that I've been on, the new ideas, the new public philosophy, things that are available to you. Now, we've talked a lot about Jacques Derrida on Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. We've hit on a variety of his notions, from différance to his conception of deconstruction to ways in which he is a resource for a deliberative democratic project. Today, though, I want to talk about a very specific idea that he develops later in his thinking, which is the notion of absolute hospitality. Now, importantly, we might say, well, why is he interested in hospitality at all? And then secondly, why that modifier, absolute? What does that do? What work does that do in changing our ordinary conceptions of how it is to be hospitable, what it looks like to show hospitality? Well, the reason that Derrida was interested in hospitality as a virtue, as a mode of existence, as an important, and you may even say fundamental idea in deconstruction itself, this is linked to his debt and relationship and friendship to Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas's notion that we are defined in our very selfhood by our relation to the other person as a moral task is crucial to Derrida as well. Rather than understanding our selfhood as primarily a matter of freedom or natural rights or political opportunities, Levinas understands the self as a response to the prior call from the other to be responsible. Levinas describes it this way: we are responsible before we are free. And therefore, our freedom is not some sort of deep thing that defines us. Our freedom is, in fact, the condition by which figuring out how best to be responsible plays out as an actual existential and social task. Well, Derrida basically appropriates this notion and then describes the task, the challenge, as one of hospitality. Are we willing to be put in question by the other? Are we hospitable to the other in ways that require us to challenge our own assumptions, to interrogate our own ideas that we take for granted? And this notion of hospitality, which he basically articulates as a kind of phrase, yes, yes, come, oui, oui, viens. This notion of come, be part of the community, sit here at the table. Yes, this yes saying, this affirmative invitation is for Derrida not an afterthought of this complicated task by which we unpack the workings of language and meaning. It is in fact why we do so in the first place. As Levinas says, and Derrida quotes him as saying, language is already hospitality. To engage in discourse, to engage in language is already to speak to respond to, and to invite responses from. So hospitality as a core conception in Derrida's thought makes some sense, both because of his indebtedness to Levinas and also his focus on language as a kind of relational dynamic between moral beings. It's the work of moral life to think well about how we speak, how we think, and how we engage. But why this absolute part? What does that do? What does it change about hospitality in an ordinary or mundane sense? Well, Derrida describes absolute hospitality as differentiated from what he calls conditional hospitality. So we might say that absolute hospitality is simply unconditional hospitality. Well, what's the difference? Conditional hospitality, he says, is when we invite the stranger in only when they have met certain preconditions to be part of the group that we identify as ours. So, have they learned our language? Have they learned our practices? Are they engaging in our modes of behavior? Once they've done those things, then the hospitality is offered because they can be part of us because they're not actually challenging who we are, right? It's conditional in the sense that come all who reinforce our sense of self. Unconditional or absolute hospitality, in contrast, fundamentally rejects any preconditions. It says, look, the invitation, the yes, yes, come, is given to all. This is actually something I think that Derrida, maybe not explicitly, but certainly has in common with Kierkegaard. When Kierkegaard describes in his communion discourses the radical importance of understanding the invitation of the communion altar in Christian churches that says, come all who are heavily burdened. This invitation is without expectation that you affirm my identity, but instead, it is a welcome to whatever identity you bring forth. This unconditional absolute hospitality, thus, is really, really risky because it not only allows the other to come when they agree with me, but it invites them to sit at the table even when they are challenging what it looks like to do so. Now, importantly, Derrida, though, doesn't go off the rails when it comes to this absolutism. He sees this as the moral requirement, but he also recognizes that there is a political constraint. And that constraint is the fact that the absolute welcome knows no bounds. It admits of no conditions. And yet the practical outcomes of issuing such a welcome is likely to create situations where we are always going to have to make hard decisions about how discourse moves forward, about who gets to sit and who doesn't. His goal here is not to say, let's just move back to a kind of conditional hospitality, but now a little bit more open-ended. His claim is the unconditional absolute hospitality is the moral demand that always calls us to task in relationship to whatever hospitality we politically show as being fundamentally limited. It's not hospitable enough. Just like Derrida understands democracy as always not democratic enough, hospitality, when distributed in historical ways, is never hospitable enough because by definition, it's got to be restrictive. It has to exclude to some degree. But that some degree is where then the unconditional call of the other returns and says, but you're still taking refuge in your own stability, your own social conceptions. What if those were challenged? Derrida's basic idea, then, is one that I think we've got to take very seriously in a world that is far too often defined by populist movements that separate in us, them in absolutist ways, that see hospitality as nothing but threat, and in fact see the idea of welcoming the stranger and the foreigner as an undermining of those things and those values that we take seriously. Derrida's point is to try to help us understand that there is no moral life that doesn't issue the yes, come, welcome to all. Anything short of that is a kind of reinforcing of our own ego, our own sense of selfhood to the exclusion of the selves of others. But he's not simply abstract and detached from the practical realities of social and political life. Derrida does admit we've got to be careful when we engage in this absolute hospitality to remember that it is not so much something we put into practice today. It is the thing that calls our today's practices into question for tomorrow. How is it that we can today perpetuate the discursive table so far as possible and then realize that exclusion continues? How can we tomorrow move past that, be more inclusive, more welcoming? And insofar as we constantly are striving to let those question marks interrogate us, open the table up, we are always living ever more into the very democratic conception of justice that Derrida thinks hospitality announces. So The goal here is not simply to learn some technical philosophy. It's trying to remind ourselves that when we go about our ordinary discourse, talking about immigrants, talking about refugees, talking about different groups who are the them to our we, are we complacent in conditional hospitality, in which case we are complicit in an exclusion of the other that is morally flawed? Or are we always challenging and critically aware that the conditional hospitality that must be shown is called to task by the unconditional, absolute demand of the other that says there's always more room at the table? Learn how to build the table differently to keep adding chairs. I find that to be an unbelievably important political conception and also a pretty cool way to make sense of our engagement with each other. May we develop this kind of hospitality as a constant task into which we live together. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. Always, please leave comments, tell me ideas or issues or questions you'd like me to consider. So I hope to see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.